remarkably successful in establishing heavy industry in just a few years, despite the enormous human cost of meeting Stalin's deadlines. In 1931, a massive tank-building program was launched. Russia was finally on its way to catching up with the industrial West. By the early 1930s, Russia had undergone a radical transformation. Determined to shake off its image as a rural backwater, in the late 1920s, Stalin had launched a ruthless program of industrialization to bring it on a par with the West. By 1931, enough factories were in place to start tank production.
When the Russians begin thinking about how they can actually put a mechanized army into effect, they think of different kinds of tanks. Tanks that can cooperate closely with the infantry, tanks that can operate in the kind of general area of the front line, and tanks that can exploit, which can go deep into the rear of the enemy's forces. The British have a similar concept with the idea of infantry tanks and cruiser tanks, and the infantry tanks attack the front line, the cruiser tanks exploit. The Russians do that as well, and they develop a kind of family of tanks. There are 4 of them in the course of the 1930s. They have a tankette, which is a British design. They buy a Vickers design off the shelf. They have a light tank, which is the T-26, which is another Vickers design brought off the shelf. And that's the tank which cooperates with the infantry. But to exploit the breakthrough, they develop this cruiser tank, and that tank is the BT.
The BT started life in 1930, when Russia bought 2 Christie tanks from the United States.
The BT was a clever bit of Russian stealing Western technology. It was a private venture developed in America by the Christie Corporation. It was really more of an armoured car than a tank, but it was armoured, it did have tracks, and it did have machine guns on it. Now, it didn't do terribly well in American trials, and indeed the Americans really never accepted the Christie suspension, although other countries did. But the Russians were interested in it, and the Russians bought 2 and had them shipped out to Russia. Now, because the Americans did not recognise the USSR, this had to be done clandestinely, and in fact they were brought out ostensibly as tractors. And then developed in Russia.
In many respects, the BT tank finally gave the Russians what they'd been looking for, or at least what certain factions within the Russian armoured forces had been looking for. It was the perfect weapon for the kind of deep manoeuvre. It was fast, it was very, very mobile. It could strike deep very, very, very quickly, and it could strike hard. This was a superb weapon for the Russians, and they recognised it as such when they saw Christie's design. And they took Christie's design, and instead of overly elaborating it as the British did, they kept true to its fundamental principles. The BT series itself was very little different from the Christie design. It deviated in only a small respect, and was gradually and incrementally up-armoured and up-armed. And really it became the design foundation for all subsequent Soviet tanks in most respects.
Designers at the Kharkov locomotive plant worked on the Christie design and came up with the BT-7 tank. It was one of the seminal designs of the 1930s.
Discover the past with exclusive military history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians, all on History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to watch everything, from the gripping story of the Band of Brothers to Operation Barbarossa and D-Day. Immerse yourself in the dramatic stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
The BT-7 was the forerunner to the T-34. It had a 3-man crew. It mounted a 45mm gun and 2 7.62mm machine guns. Its armour was up to 22mm thick. It was powered by a V12 aero engine that was capable of 500 brake horsepower, a range of 430 kilometres, and a top road speed of 73 kilometres per hour. By 1937, Russia had undergone a huge transformation. Its enormous factories were outproducing those of the West. The Red Army had the largest armoured force in the world. It was equipped with the best tank of its generation and had a sophisticated doctrine of maneuver warfare. Stalin had made his point.
I think it's the idea of competition with the West and gigantomania is very important. The idea that we have the biggest and the fastest and the most powerful kind of equipment is very important to the Russian state, not only in terms of military equipment, but for all other kinds of manufactured goods as well. In a way, one of the reasons why tanks work better than aircraft is you can build very heavy tanks. Heavy aircraft are kind of a not particularly good idea, whereas tanks can be built with very heavy armor, with very heavy guns. And they can make the kind of point which the government wants to make. So, yes, I think it's important that the Russians do make tanks with larger guns than anybody else, tanks with heavier armor than anybody else, tanks that weigh more than anyone else's tanks, because it's part of this sense of proving that Russia has socialized and is now catching up with and overtaking the developed economies of the West.
But this massive advantage was turned upside down.